Hello everyone, and welcome back to the Lostvell Chronicles. Now, I know many of you listen to these stories late at night. Some of you even fall asleep to them. So before this one begins, let me ask you something. Have you ever wondered what really happens deep underground, in places no sunlight has ever touched? Tonight's story takes us beneath the Rocky Mountains, into a case that shook Colorado in 1899, a disappearance so complete, so impossible, that engineers, investigators, and the U.S. Geological Survey still refuse to talk about it. Before we begin, comment where you're watching from. I love seeing the places our community reaches. And of course, don't forget to like the video. It helps more people discover these forgotten American mysteries. Now, dim the lights, get comfortable, and let's begin. In the winter of 1899, the Clearcreek Mining Company prided itself on one thing above all else: reliability. And nothing embodied that reputation more than the 23 men who worked the night and morning shifts of shaft number 12. A silver vein carved deep into the granite bones of the Colorado Rockies. These men were not green laborers. They were not drifters or fortune chasers. They were professionals. Men who understood the mountain the way sailors understand the sea. Every groan of timber, every shift of pressure, every whisper of cold air meant something to them. A language spoken by rock and darkness that only miners could hear. Foreman Jacob Mallory, a man with a jaw like a railroad tie and a temper as steady as winter frost, ran his team with the precision of a military officer. Under his leadership, shaft number 12 had not suffered a serious injury in nearly 3 years, a record nearly unheard of in late 19th century mining. Each man had a specialty. Elias Rowan, the powderman who could measure explosive charges by instinct. Tommy Kell, the best timber setter in 3 counties, who could reinforce a chamber in total darkness. The O'Hara twins, who moved ore carts with the coordination of a single body. Samuel Wynne, who knew the mine's ventilation system so well he could detect a blocked airway from a single breath. They joked that together they could dance blindfolded through the drifts, and it wasn't far from the truth. They knew every sound of the mountain, every harmless rumble and every dangerous vibration. Nothing surprised them, until February 9th. The shift began like any other: lanterns lit, tools checked, oxygen tested, and a final round of joking before descending into the black. Mallory gave the standard instructions: clear the new chamber, set the supports, then prepare a controlled blast to open the next section of the seam. The men worked with their usual speed and quiet confidence. Rowan measured out the powder, double-checked the fuse length, and placed the charges in the drilled holes with practiced calm. Nothing unusual, nothing reckless. The kind of blast they had performed 100 times. At 9:17 a.m., Rowan lit the fuse. Mallory called the withdrawal. 23 men stepped back behind the reinforced barrier. The blast erupted, sharp, controlled, perfectly timed. But then something happened that none of them had ever felt before. A wave of heat rolled through the shaft, not from the explosion, but from deeper in the mountain. A rushing, unnatural warmth that hit the miners like a breath exhaled from the rock itself. Some later described it as standing near a furnace door. Others said it felt like the mountain inhaling. Then came a tremor, not violent, but wrong. A low shift, like the earth adjusting itself in its sleep. The dust settled quickly. Mallory ordered the crew forward. They moved toward the new chamber and vanished from history. When the rescue crews broke through 7 days later, not a single miner remained. Their tools were neatly stacked, their lanterns extinguished, their lunch pails untouched. Whatever had happened in that moment after the blast, it had taken 23 seasoned miners without leaving a single footprint behind. And the mountain never gave them back. Foreman Jacob Mallory had approved hundreds of blasts in his 27 years underground. He could judge a charge by sound alone. the soft hiss of the fuse, the brief rumble of the detonation, the echo that told him whether the chamber had opened cleanly or needed reinforcement. February the 9th, 1899. Should have been no different. The morning's assignment was simple. Open a new side chamber to access a richer pocket of silver. Mallory inspected the drilled holes himself, checked the powder mixture twice, and confirmed that the timber supports were solid. Rowan, the powderman, nodded with that calm confidence miners trusted more than any engineer. "This one's textbook," Rowan muttered, wiping dust from his sleeves. Mallory agreed. Nothing about the setup raised concern. No signs of instability, no shifting sounds, no unusual airflow. The men stepped back behind the reinforced barrier. Lanterns flickered in the cold, still air. Then Rowan struck the match. The fuse sputtered, caught, and burned steadily toward the charge. Mallory called out, "Fire in the hole!" The blast came right on schedule. Sharp, contained, efficient. Every man braced for the familiar concussion of air and grit. But instead, something else struck them first. A heat wave. It surged through the cold shaft as if someone had opened the door to a roaring furnace deep within the rock. It wasn't the brief warmth of ignited powder. This heat rolled, steady and heavy, washing over the men like a hot wind. Mallory blinked hard, thinking his lantern had flared. Samuel Wynne, the ventilation expert, staggered back in confusion. Even Rowan whispered, "That ain't no blast heat." It lasted only a few seconds, but long enough for every man to know something unnatural had just breathed through the mine. Then came the tremor. Not violent, not explosive. Just wrong. A slow shift in the stone that felt less like a collapse and more like the mountain adjusting itself. A groaning, ancient sound rolled through the chamber, deep enough to be felt in the teeth. Mallory shouted to check the supports, but his voice was drowned by a thunderous crack overhead, a sound that echoed with finality. Before any man could react, the ceiling of the main corridor shuddered and dropped, filling the air with dust and splintered timber. The reinforced barrier, the one they had trusted to protect them, warped under the pressure. In less than 10 seconds, the entire access tunnel collapsed, sealing all 23 men more than 100 feet underground. Lanterns flickered wildly. The dust turned the air into a choking fog. Mallory forced himself forward, shouting orders through the darkness. "Check for injuries. Stay calm. Rowan Kell, sound off!" Voices answered from the haze, some steady, some strained, but all alive. The collapse had trapped them, but hadn't crushed them. When the dust settled, the miners gathered near the newly opened chamber. The air was unnaturally warm, still carrying that faint heat, like breath on cold glass. Mallory tried to reach the sealed corridor, pounding on the rock until his knuckles bled. No echo, no hollow resonance. They were entombed. Yet somewhere deeper in the mountain, a sound drifted through the darkness. Soft, distant, impossible to place. A faint tapping, rhythmic, almost deliberate. And every man froze, realizing they were not alone in shaft number 12. By noon on February the 9th, the news had raced through Clearcreek. Shaft number 12 was down. 23 men were trapped after a collapse that no one understood. Within hours, the mountain above the mine looked like a military operation. Dozens of men hauling timbers, rope, shovels, and lanterns up the slope by hand, while smoke from hastily built campfires drifted through the cold air. The rescue team began digging before the dust of the collapse had even settled. Foremen from neighboring mines volunteered their crews without hesitation. The sheriff's office sent 20 men. Ranchers from the valley showed up with horses and supplies. Families arrived by nightfall, wives clutching coats too thin for the mountain air, children wrapped in quilts, fathers pacing the ridge, refusing sleep. Search efforts continued through the night and the next and the next. The weather punished them with sharp winds and glittering sheets of frost, but no one left. Men worked in rotating shifts, some digging for 12 hours straight before collapsing beside the fire, only long enough to swallow coffee that tasted of smoke and panic. Every strike of a pickaxe felt like a heartbeat. Every crack of shifting rock brought silence. Every rumour I heard tapping spread like wildfire. On the third day, engineers marked progress. They were within 40 feet of the collapsed corridor. Hope surged through the camp. Women prepared hot meals that went untouched as rescuers shoved deeper into the mountain, carving tunnels with a precision born from desperation. On the fifth day, a chilling discovery slowed the work. Rescuers uncovered a section of timber that had been bent, not broken, by the collapse. One engineer whispered that it looked as though the pressure had come from inside the mountain, not from above. He was shushed immediately. Families grew restless. Children cried through the night. Lanterns burned constantly, throwing long shadows across anxious faces. Food ran low, but no one cared. All anyone wanted was to hear one voice, any voice, from inside that tunnel. On the seventh morning, as a pale winter sun crept over the ridgeline, a shout erupted from the lead digger. "Break through!" People surged forward. The rescuers widened the opening, cleared debris, and finally forced a narrow, man-sized gap into the collapsed corridor. A blast of cold, stale air spilled out. The lantern flames nearest the opening flickered violently, as if recoiling. One by one, rescuers crawled through. What they found was wrong. Terribly wrong. There were no men, no signs of panic, no signs of starvation, struggle, or attempted escape. Instead, the chamber was neatly arranged, as though the miners had calmly prepared for inspection. Tools stacked in rows, lanterns extinguished and lined against the wall, lunch pails unopened, sitting exactly where they had been placed 7 days earlier, coats hanging on hooks, tin mugs resting upright beside untouched canteens. The dirt floor, normally chaotic with boot prints, was smooth, perfectly smooth. Not a single footprint, not a smear of dust, not a drag mark, not a scuff. It was as if 23 men had simply evaporated. The rescuers called out names: Mallory, Rowan, Kell, O'Hara, Wynne. But their voices only echoed back, carrying an emptiness that felt heavier than the collapse itself. "Where are they?" someone whispered. No one answered. Because there was nothing to answer. The mine was silent. And the men of shaft number 12 were gone. The deeper chambers of shaft number 12 had always been narrow, but after the collapse, navigating them felt like crawling through the throat of the mountain itself. The rescuers, still shaken by the empty, untouched worksite, pressed forward in search of any clue. A note, a tool out of place, anything that might explain where 23 men could have gone. It was Samuel Burke, a deputy assigned to assist the miners, who noticed the faint discoloration on the far tunnel wall. At first glance, it looked like a trick of lantern light, an uneven patch of rock or residue left from the blast. But as the men approached, their lanterns trembling in their hands, the shape sharpened into something unmistakable. It was a human outline. Perfect, crisp, burned into the stone. The silhouette stood upright, arms slightly splayed, legs straight. The edges were so sharply defined that rescuers swore they could see individual folds of clothing, as though the figure had been pressed against the rock by an impossible intensity of heat. The stone around it was darkened in an oval, like a scorch pattern radiating outward from the shape. No miner had ever seen anything like it. Burke dropped his lantern. Another rescuer whispered, "Dear God." Foreman Mallory's name was murmured, but no one dared assume it belonged to him or to anyone they knew. One of the engineers stepped closer, running gloved fingers along the burned stone. "This isn't blast residue," he said quietly. "This is thermal imprinting. The heat required to do this." He stopped himself. The number would have been absurd. But the silhouette wasn't the worst part. A few feet surrounding the burned outline, etched into the stone with impossible precision, were symbols: geometric, angular, circular. Some intersected at perfect 90-degree angles, others curved into spirals that seemed to tighten the longer one stared at them. T. Hey were not letters, not numbers, not mining marks, surveyor's codes, or anything taught in Western geology or engineering. One miner suggested they resembled mechanical diagrams, though without any recognizable parts. Another said they looked like the old petroglyphs carved by prehistoric tribes, but cleaner, more deliberate, carved with tools no miner had access to. Even stranger, the symbols were cut into the stone smoothly, as though the mountain had been softened before being inscribed. No chisel marks, no fractures, no dust. "Who carved these?" someone finally asked. No one answered. The rescuers recorded the markings on paper, but even the drawn copies made the men uneasy. Standing in front of them felt like standing in front of instructions, diagrams meant for a purpose none of them could comprehend. The air in the chamber grew warmer the longer they remained. Several men swore they felt subtle vibrations coming through the stone, like a hum too low for hearing, sensed only in bone and teeth. Then, for the briefest moment, the burned silhouette seemed warmer than the surrounding rock. "Out!" the engineer ordered, his voice suddenly tight. "We're leaving, now!" The rescuers backed out of the chamber, lanterns shaking, none daring to look back. 23 miners were missing, but the imprint on the wall suggested at least one of them had been here, and had met an end the mountain had never seen before. When word of the burned silhouette reached the surface, the rescue effort subtly shifted. It was no longer a search for survivors. It had become a search for understanding. The rescuers sealed off the chamber and called in experts from Clearcreek, Denver, and even the Colorado School of Mines. What they expected was a simple explanation: structural stress markings, burst patterns, or fractures caused by the explosion. What they found were symbols that defied every explanation they tried to force onto them. The first to study the carvings was Chief Engineer Roland Meeks, a man known for blunt practicality. He traced the nearest line with the end of his pencil, expecting to feel the ridges of chisel marks. Instead, his fingertips glided across stone, smooth to the texture of polished slate. "Not hand-cut," he muttered. "Not machine-cut either." His assistant asked quietly, "Then what did?" Meeks didn't answer. He spent 2 hours sketching the symbols, but each time he stepped back to review his notes, he seemed increasingly unsettled. The angles were too precise. The arcs were too perfect, curving in ratios that matched none of the surveying instruments he carried. "These aren't decorations," he said finally. "They're deliberate, purposeful." But he could not say for what purpose. Next came Dr. Henry Leving, a geologist from Pueblo. He examined the wall under lantern light, then with a magnifying lens, then with his bare hands, searching for any natural explanation. To the rescue crew, he declared confidently, "These resemble pressure fracture patterns, natural stress relief from the blast." But later, in a quieter moment, he admitted to Meeks what he refused to say publicly. "I've studied fault lines from Nevada to Montana. Stress fractures don't make shapes. They don't make spirals. They don't make whatever this is." By late afternoon, a historian from the Clearcreek Historical Society arrived, an elderly man named Dr. Wilford Crane, who walked with a cane and carried more curiosity than caution. He approached the symbols with the reverence of an archaeologist entering a burial chamber. His reaction was immediate. "These aren't mining marks," he whispered. "They aren't indigenous carvings either." He pointed to one of the largest symbols, an interlocking set of triangles arranged in a rotation that matched none of the region's known cultures. "This resembles astronomical mathematics," he murmured, "similar to pre-Mesopotamian diagrams discovered in Turkey, thousands of years older than this continent's recorded civilizations." A miner scoffed. "You're telling me this mountain has math older than the Bible?" Dr. Crane didn't answer. Instead, he knelt and studied a spiral composed of perfectly spaced dots, forming a ratio that only one trained eye recognized. A logarithmic spiral, he said, drawn with a precision no miner could achieve, and certainly not in the dark during a collapse. One of the rescuers stepped closer. "So you think someone carved this?" Dr. Crane hesitated. "No," he said softly. "Not someone. Something. Something that understood mathematics far beyond what we consider possible." Silence settled over the chamber. 23 miners had vanished without leaving a footprint. But these symbols, cut into solid stone with surgical precision, suggested that whatever happened in shaft number 12 didn't begin with the explosion. Something had been waiting in that chamber long before the blast uncovered it. For 3 days after the burned silhouette was found, the mine sat under an uneasy stillness. Engineers mapped the chamber, historians debated the symbols, and Clearcreek's townspeople gathered at the entrance as if waiting for the mountain itself to confess. But it was the second rescue team, sent to explore an uncharted branch discovered behind a fallen timber brace, that heard the first sound in a mine that had otherwise gone silent. It happened just after midnight. Rescuer Daniel Hoyt was marking the tunnel wall with chalk when he stopped mid-stroke. "Hold on," he whispered. "Do you hear that?" The others strained their ears. Tap, 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 tap. 3 knocks, 2 knocks. 1. A pattern. At first the men believed it was debris settling, or perhaps echoes from the main shaft. But the sound repeated with a rhythm too deliberate, too steady to be an accident. Miners knew the language of tapping. Every mining community had stories of trapped workers signaling for rescue. But this pattern was unlike the frantic pounding of men fighting for their lives. It sounded purposeful, almost patient. Hoyt called out, "Is anyone alive in there?" His shout dissolved into the darkness. A moment later the tapping stopped. The tunnel fell so quiet that the men could hear their own breathing, the subtle hiss of their carbide lamps. The silence felt heavy, waiting, listening. The next night the pattern returned. 3 knocks, a pause, 2 knocks, a longer pause, 1. No voice followed it. No footsteps, no shifting gravel. Only that unnatural mechanical repetition, as if the mountain itself was answering some question only it understood. On the 3rd night, the team decided to push deeper into the uncharted tunnel. The passage narrowed, forcing the men to stoop, then crawl. Their lamps cast thin cones of light on walls that glimmered with a strange sheen, smooth in places where geological processes should have left rough stone. One rescuer remarked that it looked almost polished. The tapping grew louder as they advanced. 3, 2, 1. Hoyt whispered, "It's guiding us." No one disagreed. They followed the sound until they reached a junction where the tunnel branched into 2 directions, neither recorded on any map of shaft number 12. The tapping seemed to echo from both paths, bouncing around the stone, impossible to pinpoint. "Left," one man said. "Right," another insisted. Hoyt closed his eyes, listening. The tapping slowed, then repeated, slower and heavier than before. A message, a warning, or a beckoning. He raised his lantern. "We go straight," he said. There was no straight path. But as he stepped forward, the ground beneath them vibrated softly, like something shifting deep beneath the rock. The men exchanged a single terrified glance. Then the mountain moved. A deafening crack split through the passage. Dust exploded into the air. The ceiling above them groaned, twisted, then collapsed in a violent roar that sent the rescue team scrambling backward. When the dust finally cleared, the tunnel they had been following was sealed under tons of rock. Behind the collapse, silence. 3 days of tapping vanished forever. Engineers later claimed the collapse was caused by instability from the earlier explosion. But the rescuers who heard the pattern knew better. It hadn't been an accident. It had been a decision. Something deeper inside the mountain choosing to stay hidden. The decision came down faster than anyone in Clearcreek expected. 2 days after the mysterious collapse, and 3 weeks after the miners first vanished, the executives of Western Consolidated Mining gathered behind closed doors. Their verdict was blunt, cold, and final. Shaft number 12 would be sealed permanently. The official explanation given to the public was simple. Structural instability poses ongoing danger. Further rescue efforts risk additional loss of life. But those who had been inside the shaft knew the truth was not written on any report. The company wasn't afraid of rockfalls. The company was afraid of what was still alive behind them. By dawn the next morning, labourers were brought in under strict orders. No questions, no discussions, no rumours to be repeated outside the site. Their job was straightforward. Erect a reinforced barrier at the mouth of the damaged tunnel, then entomb it beneath tons of concrete. The work was to be done quickly, quietly, and without inspection from local press or families. Foreman William Darrington, a man with 20 years of mining experience, oversaw the operation. He had been one of the first to step into the silent chamber after the initial rescue breakthrough, and his face had not looked the same since. When asked privately if he believed the miners were dead, he replied only, "I believe they're gone. That's not the same thing." Workers began hauling timber and steel into position. They constructed a barricade across the entrance of the uncharted passage where the tapping had last been heard. Some joked nervously to cut the tension, but most avoided looking too long into the darkness beyond the beams. It wasn't just fear of cave-ins. It was the feeling that the darkness was looking back. At noon, the concrete mixers arrived. Barrels churned thick grey slurry as teams shoveled gravel and cement into the machines. The vibration of the engines filled the shaft like a low mechanical hum. Then something hummed back. At first the workers thought it was echo, sound ricocheting off rock. But the vibration grew stronger, pulsing like a heartbeat. The wooden beams in the barricade trembled. Dust sifted from the ceiling in a steady curtain. One of the labourers stepped away from the wall, his face pale. "It's moving," he whispered. "Something's moving behind it." Darrington barked at him to get back to work. But he didn't deny it, not after hearing it himself. The sound was unmistakable, a deep, rhythmic thrum, as if some enormous machine were turning gears far beneath the mountain. At times it slowed, at times it sped up. Once it stopped entirely, only to resume with a sudden jolt that made the steel braces shudder. When they began pouring concrete, the vibrations intensified. Not violently, but insistently, as if something inside the sealed passage was aware that its exit was closing, as if it pressed against the wall, not to break free, but to listen. Several workers refused to continue, claiming they felt the ground breathing beneath their boots. Others swore the wall grew warm to the touch whenever they approached it, radiating heat like a living thing. By sunset, the job was done. The last bucket of concrete was smoothed across the barrier, locking shut the deepest tunnel of shaft number 12. The vibrations stopped instantly. Not gradually, not fading over minutes. Instantly. As though something on the other side had finally accepted it was trapped, or worse, had simply gone still, waiting. The families of the missing men refused to let shaft number 12 disappear under concrete and company statements. They gathered in the Clearcreek Town Hall, wives, sons, brothers, demanding explanations that company officials never intended to give. Every question was met with the same polished reply. There were no written records. The men left nothing behind. But grief sharpens instincts, and the families knew when they were being lied to. On the third day of inquiries, a young clerk named Matthew Rowe approached one of the widows, Mrs. Louise Harper, outside the office. His face was pale, and he seemed terrified simply to speak. "Ma'am," he whispered, "they did leave records. 3 of them. Journals. The company took them." Mrs. Harper pressed him, gently but firmly, until his fear cracked wide open. The miners kept notebooks as a matter of routine. Foremen used them to document yields, temperatures, blasting times, and safety checks. But these particular journals, according to Rowe, they contained something else. Something the company wanted buried as badly as the sealed chamber itself. The first journal, belonging to shift leader Jacob Mallory, described the usual entries at first: blast schedules, timber inspections, ore quality. But on February 7th, 2 days before the collapse, the tone shifted. Mallory wrote that a blast in the new chamber had produced a heat not consistent with explosives, a wave that rolled through the rock as though from a fire burning inside the mountain. Heat came from the stone itself. My men felt it in their teeth. The second journal, kept by miner Saul Fletcher, was more chaotic. His handwriting deteriorated across the final 3 pages. Fletcher wrote of hearing echoes without origin in the days before the collapse, not reflections of their own voices, but rhythms and murmurs that seemed to respond. He described standing in the new chamber and hearing footsteps. But no man was walking. The rock was hollow behind us, or alive. The final entry in Fletcher's journal read, "We are not alone in this shaft." The third journal belonged to lantern tender Ezra Pike, a quiet young man known for recording even the smallest details. His final notes described a sensation of being observed whenever he entered the new passage. He wrote of the air shifting behind him, as though pushed by someone unseen. His last line, "There is movement in the stone, not animals, not men." According to Rowe, company officials confiscated the journals within hours of the rescue team's return. They were labeled irrelevant personal materials and locked in the district manager's safe. But Rowe had been present when the senior engineer finished reading the last journal. The man had slammed it shut, visibly shaken, and said only, "No one outside this building can hear about this. Ever." Rowe, trembling as he retold it, said the journals were scheduled to be sent to the Denver headquarters for archival disposal. When Mrs. Harper asked if he could retrieve them, his voice cracked in panic. "They're gone already. Shipped yesterday." Word spread quickly through Clearcreek. Families, furious and frightened, stormed the company office demanding the journals be returned. They were met with guards, locked doors, and silence. But the truth had already slipped out. The miners had written their last days. They had recorded heat that shouldn't exist, echoes that didn't belong, and the unmistakable sense that something was moving in the dark with them. Something the company had rushed to hide. And something that, if the journals were right, had made contact long before the collapse. In the months after shaft number 12 was sealed, Clearcreek tried to convince itself that the tragedy was over. The mining company insisted the collapse was an unfortunate accident. The newspapers printed sanitized versions of the event, and the official records were quietly stamped closed. But the mountain did not close the story. It reopened it, night after night. The first reports came from a group of teenagers who had hiked near the abandoned site in late spring. They returned to town pale, breathless, insisting they had seen lantern light flickering around the rim of the sealed entrance. At first, adults dismissed the account as imagination, but the teenagers' description was strangely specific. The glow didn't move like firelight. It pulsed, slowly, rhythmically, as if signaling. Within weeks, more sightings followed. A farmer riding home after dusk said he spotted 2 pale orbs drifting near the concrete barricade, hovering at the exact height lanterns would be carried. When he approached, the lights faded into nothing, but the air remained warm, unnaturally warm for a cold Colorado night. Then came the tapping. Hikers traveling near the old shaft began reporting faint metallic knocks drifting through the trees. Always the same pattern. 3 taps. 2 taps. 1. Silence. The exact sequence the second rescue team had heard deep inside the uncharted tunnel before the collapse cut them off. At first, locals tried to rationalize it. Perhaps water dripping through old timbers or rocks shifting under temperature changes. But those who listened closely swore the pattern was too deliberate, too mechanical, too human. By autumn, the sightings had become part of Clearcreek's whispered lore. Parents warned their children not to play near the old mining road. Travelers avoided the area after dark. Even seasoned hunters refused to camp within a mile of the sealed entrance. The most chilling testimony came from a man the town trusted implicitly, former foreman Martin Griggs, a man not known for superstition or exaggeration. One night, after returning from a failed hunting trip, he went straight to the sheriff's office with trembling hands and refused to sit down. His voice shook as he described what he had seen. "I wasn't drinking. I wasn't imagining things," he said. "They were standing right there. All of them. Lanterns in hand." Griggs claimed that at dusk, as he followed a trail that skirted the old shaft, he saw 3 figures standing perfectly still at the sealed entrance. Their silhouettes were unmistakable: broad shoulders, work coats, hats pulled low. Each figure held a lantern, the glow casting faint halos onto the concrete wall. But the lanterns never flickered. "They weren't moving, not even breathing," Griggs whispered, "just watching the shaft." When he called out, the figures didn't turn toward him. Instead, the lanterns dimmed, slowly, as if being lowered behind an invisible curtain. When he blinked, they were gone. Only the stale, iron-scented heat remained. Word of Griggs's sighting spread through Clearcreek like wildfire. Some believed the figures were the missing miners themselves, trapped in some form beyond understanding. Others whispered about things far older than the mining town. Entities awakened by the blast, disturbed from a sealed chamber that had held them for centuries. Whatever walked near shaft number 12, one thing was certain. The seal might have closed the mine, but the legend beneath it was still very much alive. More than a century has passed since the collapse of Clearcreek Shaft No. 12, yet the story has never faded, not in the town records, not in the whispered warnings of old-timers, and not in the quiet dread that still clings to that stretch of the Colorado mountains. The mining company abandoned the site in 1901, hoping time would cover the mystery the way snow covers the ridges each winter. They poured concrete, fenced the area, and posted signs warning of unstable terrain. But the barrier only sealed the entrance. It did nothing to silence what remained behind it. Every February, always February, locals claim the tapping begins again. It starts faintly, like a loose pipe echoing in the cold. But there are no pipes on the mountain. Then the pattern emerges, the same one recorded by the second rescue crew in 1899. 3 knocks, 2 knocks, 1 silence. Some years, the pattern repeats for hours. Other years, it sounds only once, like a reminder the town would rather forget. And though no one will admit it publicly, there isn't a single long-time resident who hasn't heard it at least once. In the harsh winters, when blizzards roll down from the divide and the world shrinks to white, the tapping changes. It becomes fuller, deeper, like underground machinery turning in slow, ponderous rhythms. On those nights, even the bravest residents say the mountain vibrates ever so slightly, as if something inside it is straining to move. The strangest accounts come from hikers who walk the ridge above the sealed shaft at dusk. Many say they've heard voices drifting up from the stone, soft, rhythmic, almost chanting. Not words exactly, just tones, cadences. Some swear it's the sound of men calling to one another. Others insist it's not human at all. One former park ranger described it as the sound of breath caught between rock and earth, a phrase that still unsettles anyone who hears. Yet as the decades passed, theories multiplied. Some believe the miners broke into a prehistoric cavern, one untouched since the last ice age, disturbing gases or geological phenomena that triggered hallucinatory events. Others argue the symbols carved into the rock, the burned silhouette, and the precision of the markings suggest something and someone was already living deep beneath the mountain. A few, usually the oldest in town, whisper another explanation entirely. The mountain kept them. Not killed, not buried, kept. As if the 23 men were taken into its depths, absorbed into something ancient that didn't appreciate being awakened. In 1999, on the 100th anniversary of the collapse, a group of geology students from Denver University attempted to survey the site with new ground-penetrating equipment. Their instruments malfunctioned repeatedly, registering voids that shifted location between scans. One student later claimed the seismic return looked almost like a moving chamber, something that made no geological sense. The university quietly cancelled further research. Today, the old shaft is more overgrown than ever, swallowed by pines and snowdrifts that change shape with every storm. But the concrete barrier still stands, cracked in 3 places, though the company insists it's only from weathering. Locals know better. Every February, when the air is sharp and the night falls too quickly, they hear it again. 3 taps, 2 taps, 1. As if someone, or something, deep in the stone is still calling out, long after the 23 men of shaft number 12 vanished without a trace. And if you ask anyone in Clearcreek why the mountain still speaks, they'll tell you quietly, because it never gave them back. And that brings us to the end of tonight's mystery. What do you think happened to the men of Clearcreek Shaft number 12? Did they discover something they shouldn't have? Or did something ancient discover them? Let me know your theory in the comments. I read every single one. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to like the video and subscribe so you don't miss the next forgotten American mystery. Until next time, sleep well, and if you ever hear tapping in the walls or beneath the floor, don't answer it.